Good evening, my holy sisters and brothers. How are you? Great to be learning together on a Monday night. Let's light up the darkness. And who is with us? Yehud in South Carolina, Bill in Missouri, Shandor in the Bronx, Stephen in Las Vegas, Nancy in North Carolina, Pam in Oregon, Sharon in New Jersey, Jonathan in Thousand Oaks. Renee in Indiana, Melissa in Great Neck, Peggy in Colorado, Lonnie in Florida, Joe in Inland Empire, Sandy in Michigan. Over there on the YouTube side, Ella says shalom, James says shalom from Indianapolis, Marjorie in Georgia, and Aoife in Florida. Welcome everybody. Great to be together. Got your thinking caps on? Not easy stuff. Right now we are really developing our Gemara cup, right? Our Gemara cup. Cup is head. So this is material that is challenging. It is definitely not easy. But I think we can make some progress in understanding. So this law of the Nazir, right? And what exactly comes under the prohibition of deriving no benefit from the grapevine, right? So as we've seen, for sure he can't eat grapes. The Nazir, during his term of Naziris, can't eat grapes. He can't drink wine. He can't drink grape juice. Brandy made from grapes. Those things are obvious. And then what we saw in our discussion yesterday is there's a disagreement between Rabbi Elazar and the majority, where Rabbi Elazar says you can't eat anything of the grapevine, right? And this comes to include leaves and tendrils, right? So grape leaves, like stuffed grape leaf, Rabbi Elazar would say no. But the majority who disagree with Rabbi Elazar say, no. We're talking about the fruit of the grapevine and products of the fruit, right? So the grape and anything that's derived from the grape, and that does not include leaves and tendrils, etc. So then, okay, well, how does each derive his point of view? How does the majority derive their point of view? How does Rabbi Elazar derive his? So Rabbi Elazar is relying on a different system of interpretation. It's not a different system, but a different rule. You know, if you look in a Hebrew prayer book, in the morning we read the 13 principles of interpretation that Rabbi Yishmael lists. And both of these principles are listed there. One is restrictions and amplifications, and the other is details and generalizations. And whether they apply one rule or the other, they come out in a different place. And we're continuing our discussion of, which do we use and why and how do we apply it. And this is very difficult stuff. This is definitely stuff we don't do on our own, right? And this is why you have to have a Rav in your life, right? If you're a Jew and you're trying to live an observant Jewish life, you have to have a Rav in your life who is highly trained in all these laws. And really, no one is deriving laws like this anymore. Our sages did these derivations from the Torah. New questions still come up, but usually, modern sages are not going to be deriving generalizations from the Torah. They'll look to Shulchan Aruch, right, the codification of Jewish law that was created about 500 years ago, and then see what laws that are already derived by our sages, and then finally codify what's the closest one that applies to the novel situation. Something with modern technology, modern medicine, new questions come up all the time. But we're not going to go all the way back, usually to the Torah, trying to derive these principles. That's something that our sages did, almost 2,000 years ago. But we are trying to understand how they did it, right? And so and today we're going to see several examples of how they use this system or this rule of generalization, detail, generalization, or restriction, amplification, restriction. Right? So the basic thing is that the Torah says that the Nazir, listing all these rules of the Nazir, it says that he can't, eat from the grapevine. But then it lists examples of what he cannot eat. And then it goes back and generalizes again. So that's one of those situations where there's generalization, detail, generalization, or maybe it's detail, generalization, detail, which might produce a different result. And this is one of the places where that particular rule might be sourced. There's other examples of it, as we shall see, but the case of the Nazir is actually one of the places where the sages look to say, this is a rule that we have, and this is how we use it. And then they'll actually apply the rule in other contexts as well. So let's continue this discussion. So we've cited a Baraisa at length, and the master said above, if so, just as the items that are mentioned in the detail are clearly defined as a complete fruit, right? So this was as opposed to, yesterday we were looking at, so someone takes a vow of Nazirus, and during this term of Nazirus, we know he can't eat grape, he can't drink grape juice, wine, brandy, etc. What about an unripe grape? Turns out, no, he cannot eat an unripe grape. They are also considered fruit of the vine. What about a spoiled grape, a rotten grape, a mealy grape, a wormy grape, right? These are the kinds of questions that were asked, right? So the detail seems to be clearly defined as a complete fruit. Well, okay, so you understand you can't put a grape in your mouth. What about a grape skin? What about a grape seed? Does that amount to a whole grape or not? It seems that the detail is clearly defined as a complete fruit, and so too everything that is prohibited is a complete fruit. So you say, if so, what has the verse left you to derive from its meaning that it has not stated? Grapes and raisins, these are written. Wine and vinegar, these are written. You cannot learn in accordance with the last version. Rather, you must learn in accordance with the first version. And as we eventually include everything, what is the meaning when the verse states, from pit to grapeskin? Right? So the Torah says you can't eat anything from the grapevine from pit to grapeskin. It could have just said nothing from the grapevine or no fruit of the vine. But it says that nothing from pit to grapeskin. So this serves to tell you that wherever you find a detail and a generalization, you cannot broaden it and learn that the generalization is limited to be like the detail. Rather, the generalization becomes added to the detail until the verse specifies for you, now we're at the top of 35a, in the manner that it's specified with regard to a Nazir. Just stay with me. Very likely you're a little like, what did he say? What did he say? I'm having trouble following it. Just stay with it. Keep listening, and it starts to become clear, almost like a camera coming into focus. Right, so the verse specified with regard to a Nazir, Numbers 6:4, from pits to grapeskin, right? So it added these details to the generalization that he can't eat the fruit of the grapevine. So the Gemara asks, and according to the opinion of Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, who establishes this verse, from pits to grapeskin, as serving to say that a Nazir is liable only if he eats 2 grape seeds and a grape skin. Right, so if he's not eating a whole grape and he just eats 1 grape seed, so maybe he's not liable for violating his Naziris, since the verse specified grape seeds and a grape skin. Seeds, plural, so at least 2. So maybe if you only eat 1 grape seed, you haven't violated the prohibition while you're a Nazir. So Elazar ben Azariah says that because it says from pits, plural, to grape skin, So this is serving to say that a Nazir is liable only if he eats 2 grape seeds and a grape skin. So if so, where does he derive the detail? It is unclear how he applies this method of a detail, a generalization, and a detail. According to his interpretation, the phrase from pits to grape skin does not serve to limit the previous generalization, but rather brings in its own law. He's learning out that pits to grape skin tells you that you only become liable for violating this law if you eat 2 grape seeds and a grape skin, as opposed to just eating a whole grape. If you're not eating a whole grape, but you have just little parts of it, so you have to eat two seeds and a skin before you become liable. So if so, that he's learned that law from this detail from pits to grape skin, so then we can't say that we're in the system or using that, exegetical principle of generalization and then detail and then generalization, or detail, generalization, and then detail, because this detail doesn't come to modify what came before, or to specify, or to exclude, or to include. Rather, it just brings its own law. So how can you say that he's in that system of detail, generalization, detail, when he's learning its own law from that two seeds and a skin? So the Gemara answers, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah holds in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Elazar, different sages, right? It's Elazar who has told us that he's using restrictions and amplifications in his debate with the majority. Now we're bringing in a new law that Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah holds, but he does hold in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Elazar, who interprets this by saying that a verse restricts and amplifies. And if you wish, say instead that Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah does hold in accordance with the opinion of the rabbis, that this is a case of a detail, a generalization, and a detail. As if it should enter your mind that the verse is merely teaching that which Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah brought, that you don't become liable until you eat 2 seeds and a skin, then let the merciful one, God, write this phrase, from pits to grape skin, alongside the other details of wine and vinegar. For what law did the Torah write from pits to grape skin after the generalization? So conclude from it that you should derive this halacha, this law, by means of the method of generalization and a detail, right? It was placed, that detail was placed where it was placed in the, when the Torah is expounding the laws of what a Nazir is and what he's prohibited to eat. The location of that particular detail was placed there in order to tell us that the correct system of interpretation for additional laws that aren't spelled out in the Torah is detail and generalization, rather than Rabbi Elazar's thought to use restrictions and amplifications. Now the Gemara asks, but if so, you can say that the entire phrase comes only for this purpose, for a generalization and a detail. And Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah should not derive his halacha that a Nazir becomes liable only if he eats 2 grape seeds and 1 grape skin from this verse at all. If that verse is placed where it's placed in order to tell us that we should be using the system of generalizations and details, how can Elazar ben Azariah learn an additional law from that phrase? And the Gemara answers that Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah would say to you, if so, let the Torah write either 2 grape seeds and 2 grape skins with both terms in the plural, or a grape seed and a grape skin with both terms in the singular. For what law did the merciful one write from pits, plural, to grape skin, singular? Learn from it that one should interpret it in the matter of a generalization and a detail, and one can also bring from it the law that a Nazir is liable only if he eats 2 grape seeds and a grape skin. Now the Gemara asks, and Rabbi Elazar, not Elazar ben Azariah, but Elazar, who interprets by the method of restriction and amplification, which is the method that led him to say that grape leaves are prohibited. The majority, using generalizations and details, concluded that grape leaves are not included in the prohibition and Nazir can eat those. Right, so where am I? So I'm sure I'm in the right place. And so the Gemara asks, and Rabbi Elazar, who interprets by the method of restriction and amplification, that even tendrils and the leaves of a grapevine are included in the Nazir's prohibition, from where does he derive the method of a detail, a generalization, and a detail? Right? So this system of deriving laws that tell you what's included in a prohibition, in a Torah prohibition, the system of, or that principle, one of Rabbi Yishmael's 13 principles, the one of a detail, generalization, detail, the rabbis, the majority, derive it from the law of the Nazir. But Rabbi Elazar doesn't think that it applies to the law of the Nazir. Now, he doesn't deny that there is an exegetical principle called detail, generalization, detail, but he doesn't derive it from Nazir. He derives it from a different location in the Torah. And as we see how he would derive it, we're going to start to understand a little bit better what it means, detail, generalization, detail. So Rabbi Elazar, who looks at the law of the Nazir and uses restriction and amplification, from where else in the Torah does he learn the method of a detail, a generalization, and a detail? Rabbi Bahu says Rabbi Elazar would derive it from this verse, which is at Exodus 22:9, and this is the law of a Baali, right? So when somebody has custody of property that belongs to someone else, there's one of four relationships that could exist, right? If my buddy Roy, right, is holding on to my car, he's got my car. It's my car, and right now Roy has possession of it. So there's four possibilities of why Roy has possession of it that are legal. It's not that he stole it. One, I lent it to him. So he bears the most of the responsibility of making sure it's returned to me intact. Or number two, I'm asking him to take care of it, right? Please take care of my car while I'm away. That's an unpaid bailee. So now he's going to have much less responsibility than if he borrowed it. Another relationship is he rented it. Okay, he's paying me in order to use the car. So now that I'm receiving money for his use of it, that has a different set of obligations and responsibilities and privileges associated with it, right? So there's the paid shomer. I lend it to him, right? Because he asked to borrow it, or I ask him to watch it for me, or I pay him to watch it for me. There he has the most responsibility, or he pays me in order to use it. So depending on which of those four relationships we have, there's going to be different, and then something goes wrong with the car, who's liable to fix it, right? And in one case, he's going to have to establish that he didn't act negligently because it's assumed that it's his responsibility. But if I'm paying him to watch the car, if I'm paying it, he's going to have more responsibility. If he's paying me to use the car, and then something happens while he was using it, but I got benefit from renting it out, I'm going to have less of a case, right? Maybe I should have expected that when I rent out a car, eventually something will happen to it, and it's my job to have it fixed, right? So this is the general body of law that we're going to use. So Rabbi Abahu is saying that Rabbi Elazar would derive from this verse. And if a man delivered to his neighbor a donkey or an ox or a sheep, or any animal to guard, and it dies, the oath of the Lord shall be between them both, right? So I deliver to my neighbor a donkey, an ox, or a sheep, or any animal to guard. That's the key, to guard, right? So he's going to guard it for me. Now, is he doing me a favor by guarding it, or am I paying him to guard it? That's going to create a difference. But in one case or the other, there's going to be an oath of the Lord, meaning if something happens to it, to the animal that he's guarding for me while it's in his care, he'll have to take an oath that he did not act negligently, that he did, what was good and proper in guarding the animal, but it was kind of an act of God, right? So some unexpected, unforeseeable calamity, like a lion broke out of the zoo, came here and ate the ox. That was my ox that he was guarding for me. And he'll swear that he was not negligent, right? So, but look how the law is stated. And if a man delivered to his neighbor, now we know what principle what we're talking about. And now details, a donkey or an ox or a sheep. Now a generalization, or any animal to guard. and it dies, the oath of the Lord shall be between them. Now the phrase a donkey or an ox or a sheep, this is a detail. But then the Torah adds, or any animal, right? That is a generalization that includes all animals. And then in the phrase to guard, the Torah detailed again. So this is a detail, a generalization, and a detail. Right? It could have just said, if a man delivered to his neighbor an ox, a sheep, or a donkey, and to guard, and then something happened to one of those three animals, right? So then we would think, well, it only applies to those three animals. So the Torah added, or any animal. Then there it generalized. Oh, well, so in that case, any animal that I ask my neighbor to watch is going to be included in this law. But then the Torah says to guard. So now we're only talking about animals that are somehow similar to a sheep, an ox, or a donkey in that they can be guarded. And what does that tell you? That tells you that it's a domesticated animal. It's not that I asked him to watch a bear or a lion that can't be guarded in the same way. So that's a detail, a generalization, and a detail. And so in this case, you may deduce that the verse is referring only to animals that are similar to the detail, i.e. items that can be guarded. Now, Rava disagrees with Rabbi Abahu. He says, actually, Rabbi Elazar would derive the principle detail, generalization, detail, not from the case of the Bailey watching his neighbor's animal, but rather from this verse in Leviticus 1:10. And if his offering is from the flock, whether of the sheep or of the goats, for a burnt offering, he shall offer it a male without blemish. So the phrase, and if his offering is from, this is a detail, as it indicates part, but not all of something, right? Not a whole group, just one animal. The flock, this is a generalization that includes animals that have been used sinfully. And when it's stated sheep and goats, the Torah has detailed again. So this is a detail and a generalization and a detail. And therefore, you may deduce that this verse is referring only to items that are similar to the detail. And the details teach that only animals that copulated with a person may not be brought as offerings. In other words, this is a location where the Torah didn't say anything about bestiality. Elsewhere it does. Right? It says that if a human copulates with an animal, they shall both be put to death, right? There's a death penalty offense. It's a whole other body of law. Of course, there's, for it to be capital punishment, the person would have had to be warned. If you do that, you're going to be liable to the death penalty. And 2 witnesses saw the warning, and then he did it anyway. So then that person would be put to death. It's never happened, I'm sure. But the point is that the body of law is there. Now, does the Torah specify somewhere else that, what kinds of animals can be brought as burnt offerings, right? First of all, they're going to be domesticated animals like sheep or goats. And the rabbis are deriving that even though it doesn't say that it has to be an animal that was never used for bestiality, it doesn't say that explicitly, but this is going to be their place where they're going to say, no, that was a detail, a generalization, and a detail. And it came to teach that an animal that's going to be brought as an offering in the temple could never have been used in that sinful way. Now, Ravia, why did they pick that law to come from that detail, generalization, detail? I'm sure they had a tradition, they had a reason, there was more to it than that, right? Why they were able to pick that specific law for that generalization and detail, that there was room to bring a new legal interpretation. Why that particular law, they had a reason. But that there was room to bring an interpretation is because it was detail, generalization, detail. Now, Rabbi Yehuda of Discarda said to Rava, and let Rabbi Elazar derive the method of detail, generalization, and a detail from a different verse. Now, it's a third verse where Rabbi Elazar might have learned how to use detail, generalization, detail from somewhere else in the Torah rather than the law of the Nazir. So look at Leviticus 1:2, also about the law of offerings. From animals, from the herd or from the flock, you shall bring your offering. So you do it in the following manner. From is a detail that excludes an undomesticated animal. Animals is a generalization which includes undomesticated animals. And then when it states herd and flock, the Torah has detailed again. And this is a detail and a generalization and a detail. And therefore, you may deduce that the verse is referring only to items that are similar to the detail, meaning domesticated animals. You can't, trap a deer and then, put a rope around its neck, walk it to the temple, and bring it as a sacrifice, because deer are not domesticated animals. They're not included in the class of animals that one could bring as an offering in the temple. And we learn that from here. So Rava said to Rav Yehuda of Discarda, one cannot derive the method of detail, generalization, and detail from this verse, the verse you just brought. As if the source were from there, I would say that the phrase animals is referring even to undomesticated animals, as an undomesticated animal is included in the general category of animal. Rav Yehuda of Discarda said to Rava, how can you suggest that in this verse an undomesticated animal is included in the general category of animal? It is written herd and flock. Herd and flock are words that clue us in to the fact that we're only talking about domesticated animals that are herded and flocked. And this entire phrase is a detail and a generalization and a detail, from which you may deduce that the verse is referring only to items that are similar to the detail, which in this case are herd and flock, not undomesticated animals. We're on 35b now. So the Gemara asks, and from where do we derive that it is so, that in the methodology of generalizations and details, that the generalizations are similar to the details? How do you know that that's the way this law works, this principle works? It is as it is taught in a Baraisa. The verse states with regard to the mitzvah, the commandment, to bring money for the second tithe to Jerusalem, right? So when the temple is standing and let's say you're a farmer and you bring in your crop, right? So remember the tithing process. The first 2% is the teruma, and that's going to go to a priest. And then the next, the 2%, and then the next 10% is for the Levite, right? And you're going to give it to the Levite. And then there's the second tithe, right? The next 10% after that. Now, in 4 of the 7 years of the Shemitah cycle, the sabbatical cycle, that's called the Meiser Sheni, the second tithe. And you keep it for yourself, but you can only spend it in Jerusalem. In other words, you put that money aside so that you have the wherewithal to go to Jerusalem for the pilgrimage festivals, Passover, Shavuos, and Sukkot. Right? So that's second tithe. And then in 2 of the 7 years, it's given to the poor. Okay, so now that we're in the law of the second tithe. So the verse states with regard to the mitzvah to bring money for the second tithe to Jerusalem, right? So you have what to eat and drink in Jerusalem during a festival. And the law says, the Torah says, and you shall bestow the money on all that your heart desires. Right? So the Torah could have stopped there, but now it gives, so that's a generalization. Now the Torah gives details of what it is that you could spend your money on. Right? So you shall bestow the money on all that your heart desires. Now the details, on cattle, on sheep, on wine, and on strong drink. And then it generalizes again, and on whatever your soul requests, right? So the law could have just said, you will take your second tithe and go up to Jerusalem and spend it on whatever your heart desires. But then the Torah gives examples, right? So cattle, so you can eat beef. On sheep, so you can eat mutton. On wine, which is wine, and strong drink. But then the Torah adds, and on whatever your soul requests. Now that's totally unnecessary phrase. Why does it add, once it already says you can spend the money on whatever your heart desires, and then it gives 4 examples, cattle, sheep, wine, or strong drink. Why does the Torah then add, and on whatever your soul requests? Generalization, then 4 details, then another generalization. It must be that extra general phrase, which was not added for no reason, right? There's no extraneous words in the Torah. So it must be that that additional generalization at the end comes to tell us something about a law. So the Baraisa elaborates. The phrase, and you shall bestow the money on all that your heart desires. This is a generalization. As no particular type of food is specified, right? You can eat anything you want. The phrase on cattle, on sheep, on wine, and on strong drink, this is a detail. So specific foods are mentioned. And then the verse concludes on whatever your soul requests. It then generalized again, as no specific type of food is stated in the final phrase. So the verse is formulated as a generalization and a detail and a generalization. And from this, you may deduce that it is referring only to items similar to the detail. Yeah, you can spend your money on whatever you want, but only on items that are similar to the detail, somehow similar to cattle, sheep, wine, and strong drink. Well, what do those 4 items have in common so that we can understand what is the principle that's being taught here? So just as the items mentioned in the detail are clearly defined as the produce of produce, i.e., not only the produce itself, but also items that come from it, such as grapes from a seed, and they are also grown from the ground, as all of these items grow from the ground. What? Cattle and sheep grow from the ground? Or receive their main sustenance from the ground, right? You can't eat a predator, but you can eat an animal that eats grass, right? So the generalization. So these are all things that are derived from the ground, right? Either the wine that comes from grapes that come from the ground, or the strong drink that comes from grapes that come from the ground, or the cattle and sheep that eat the grass that comes from the ground. So these items are all produce of produce that are grown from the ground. So this includes birds. Birds eat produce from the ground. But what is not included? Fish. You can't spend your Meiser Sheni, your second tithe money, on fish, nor on water, nor on salt, right? You can buy those things while you're in Jerusalem for the festival, but you can't use your second tithe money to purchase those things. Now, the Gemara discusses a series of problems with regard to these and other methods of halakhic exegesis. Now, in the case of a generalization and a detail and a generalization, one derives that all items which are like the detail are included. However, that is so. What purpose does the last generalization stated in the verse serve? The same conclusion would be reached if the verse had stated merely a generalization and a detail. If it just said, you can use your second tithe on whatever your heart desires on cattle, sheep, wine, or strong drink. Okay, so we would have understood that you can only spend it on items that are like these 4 that have something in common with them, and that is how we detail. The detail sort of limited. First, it said whatever your heart desires. You might think you could spend it on anything you want. Then it gave 4 details, and we learned, it has to be produce or produce of produce. Okay. So then what does the last generalization add when it again says whatever your soul requests? What does that final generalization come to tell us? Does it limit what we could spend on, or does it, grow the pool of possible items that we could purchase with second tithe money? What purpose does the last generalization stated in the verse serve? The same conclusion would be reached if the verse had stated merely a generalization and a detail. And the Gemara answers, the purpose of the last generalization is to add all that is similar to it, i.e., even those articles or cases not explicitly listed among the details. And furthermore, in the case of a detail and a generalization and a detail, we've been talking about generalization, detail, generalization. What if it's detail, generalization, detail? So in that case, one again derives that all items which are like the detail are included. So if so, what purpose does the last detail stated in the verse serve? The same conclusion would apply if there was simply a detail and a generalization. And the Gemara answers, if it were not for the last detail, when the sequence is detail, generalization, detail, I would say that the generalization becomes added to the detail, which is broadened in all possible ways. Therefore, the last detail limits the generalization to items or cases that are similar to the detail. So the Gemara continues this line of questioning. Okay, so now that it has been established that both with regard to 2 generalizations and a detail, i.e. generalization, detail, generalization, and with respect to 2 details and a generalization, meaning detail, generalization, detail, so one derives that all items that are like the detail are included. So what difference is there between this method and that one? Is it this? Do we come out in the same place if it was generalization, detail, generalization versus detail, generalization, detail? Do we end up in the same place? Do these teach exactly the same thing? And the Gemara answers, there is a difference between them. As whereas in a case of two generalizations and a detail, if there is another detail that is similar to the detail specified in the verse, even in one aspect, one includes it due to the two generalizations. By contrast, in the case of two details and a generalization, if there is another detail that is similar to the one mentioned in the verse in two aspects, one includes it. However, if it is similar only in one aspect, one does not include it, right? So if, in other words, a different case is proposed, that you've listed a few types of fruit, and we're wondering if an additional fruit is covered. Okay, well, fruit and fruits are going to be very similar in many aspects. But if you say, well, is a vegetable going to be permitted? That a vegetable and a fruit have fewer similarities. However, they both come from the ground. They're both farmed. So, it might be that they have two aspects in common, or it might not. But, when you go from detail, generalization, detail, you're going to need more than one aspect in common in order to include a detail in the list of permitted cases. So the Gemara asks, and I'm almost done, so your questions or comments, now is the time. So the Gemara asks another question. Now, in the method of a detail and a generalization, the generalization becomes added to the detail, and all matters are included by the generalization. And the method of restriction and amplification that Rabbi Lazar used also amplifies and includes everything, and therefore all matters are included in both cases. So if so, what is the difference between the method of restriction and amplification that Rabbi Lazar uses versus the method of generalization and detail that the rabbis use to exclude grape leaves from the prohibition of a Nazir? Right? Rabbi Lazar said, no, he can't eat grape leaves because he used restriction and amplification. And the majority said the Nazir can eat grape leaves, that they're not included in the prohibition, and that's because the majority used the principle of generalization and detail. So how did they arrive at that difference? What is the difference between these two methods? And the Gemara answers, this is the difference. Whereas in the method of a detail and a generalization, one includes and renders forbidden to a Nazir even leaves and tendrils of the vine, with the method of restriction and amplification, one includes less, as tendrils, yes, they are included in the prohibition, whereas leaves, no, they are not included. And it's a difficulty because that's not where we started, right? Rabbi Lazar prohibits both tendrils and leaves. And now they're saying that Rabbi Lazar, either he applied it wrong or somehow the text changed and there's a difficulty. And that's where we're going to leave off today. Okay, let's see who's got comments or questions. Difficult material. Nazir 35. Says Bill, I wanted to say thank you for this class, Sal. Monday night is a campus ministry night for me, and I bring up insights from AT Daily every week, including this one. Oh, thank you, Bill. I'm so honored and delighted to be of service to you. I'm so glad it's useful. Bell, so all these cases are comestibles. Does that mean the second tithe couldn't be used for cloth or clothes for the journey? Pre-polyester, all cloth did originate from the ground. If you can eat mutton, can you buy the wool, for example? See, that's a great question. When they say cattle and sheep, whatever your soul requests, whatever your heart desires, are we talking about eating and drinking? That you could eat the meat or drink the milk of the cow, right? That you could eat the meat or drink the milk of the sheep? Or are we saying that you could enjoy the wool of the sheep or you could enjoy the leather that comes from the cow? I don't know. That's a fantastic question. It really shows that you understand, the principles that are in question here. Peggy, I am confused. If there is a law that describes an action and the action is prohibited, shouldn't that be the last word? Seems as if there are ways to get around the law. You can't eat the grapes, period. Right, but when But then why did the Torah add? It was clear that you can't eat the grapes, right? And that was included raisins and grape juice, wine, vinegar, strong drink, etc. So then why did it add you can't eat the grape seeds and the skin? We already knew that from the fact that you can't eat grapes. So Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah said, well, that was added just to tell you that even if you only ate grape seeds and grape skin, you become liable for violating that law. But the sages said, no, we learn more than that. Right? We learn more than that, and we learn that it has to be like the fruit. And this is where we get into these generalizations and specifications and details. And the important thing is here, very important to understand that we as moderns don't apply these principles to create new laws, right? It's like this process was done, and it took hundreds of years by sages who were much closer in time to the giving of Torah. It's like sort of, in many ways, Torah knowledge has absolutely increased. Like all kinds of knowledge increases over the centuries as more and more people participate in it over time, and they learn from each other. But on the other hand, they were closer to sort of the pure intent of the law as it was given to Moses. And some of the traditions that they received, they had access to when they derived these laws, where some of those traditions were lost, but the laws that were codified out of those traditions remain. So we don't use these principles to figure out new laws, but they did. Is it hard to understand how they did it? Yes, it's hard. It really is. Joseph, the way I'm understanding this is that the rabbis try to categorize things in situations to simplify the myriad of possibilities. I would say that that's true. And I also say that, and this is certainly the kind of, legal interpretation that we still do, right? Now, we may not, interpret written Torah laws the way that they did, but we certainly bring up problems all the time. And we say, like we notice in the Torah, I can't think of an example right now, but we bring up shilas all the time, where one of the main things that the sages will always look at, and that we still look at, is that there's no extra words in the Torah, right? So if there are these additional phrases that didn't need to be there, and we would have understood the law that's written there without the additional phrase, then what does the additional phrase come to teach us, right? What does it come to teach us? That's very important, right? That's what I've got for us today. I hope this was instructive and enlightening, my friends. These kinds of matters are very complicated and difficult, and I'm still wrestling with it. But the more we engage with it, the more that we start to get that kind of Gemara kop, right? That Talmudic way of thinking. And then we can apply it, in more modern situations where we're seeing that this idea of, well, wait a minute. He could have said it like this. He said it like that. Why did he say it like that? Was it just the speech of humans who just add words for no reason? Well, humans do that, but God doesn't do that, right? So if God includes a seemingly superfluous phrase, he must have had a reason. What's the reason? First thing we do is we check if this question's been asked before, and invariably it has, since we have such a long tradition of incredibly bright minds peering into these questions. Sometimes there's a chiddush. Sometimes there's a new question that is brought up. Okay, my friends, God willing, we'll be together again tomorrow, Tuesday, at the regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific. Have a great night.